Sam McAlister, it's so great to meet you. And of course, we're here to talk about the new movie Scoop on Netflix, which is all about your pursuit of a big interview with Prince Andrew.
I've never been smuggled into a palace before.
And before we talk about that, I'd love to hear a little more about how you got into this crazy business because you started out as a criminal defense lawyer.
Yeah, that's right. I did. And I have to be honest with you, I did it for a couple of years and I'd spent a lot of time in education, obviously, but I hated it with a visceral passion. And I thought, can I do this for another 30, well, nowadays, 40 or 50 years? And the answer was a resolute no. So I did something that I'd learned from my time at college, which was connections. And I asked three friends who did interesting jobs if I could spend some time with them. And one of them happened to be a journalist at the BBC. And the rest is history.
Is that how you got your foot in the door at the BBC through your friend?
Yeah, I mean, I feel bad now. It sounds terribly anti-meritocratic, but I'd grown up in this country and the weird class system we have. My parents left school at 14. We had no connections or contacts, and I learned that was hugely important. So I went and did 2 days work experience effectively as a 26-year-old ex-criminal defense lawyer. And everyone on the team was working on legal stories. And I was the only one that had legal training. And, they think the law. So I didn't tell them otherwise, and it went well. And then I was offered 6 weeks, and 6 weeks became, I think, God, it must have been 16 years.
Wow. And you worked for a show called Newsnight, which is probably one of the most esteemed shows at the BBC. And yet you were portrayed as kind of more of a tabloidy Daily Mail type journalist. How true was that? And how much did you have sort of a push and pull with the journalists who wore the capital J on their jumpers, as you would call them?
I love that description. Oh, look, basically you have to truncate everything into a small space. So I suppose the way that we give you an idea that I'm slightly different from some of the rest of the team who are all fantastic, brilliant, hard, committed journalists, just so clever and so hardworking. But in truth, I was really interested in newslines. I wanted my work to make impact. And as you can probably tell, I'm not a snob of any kind, and I'm a huge fan of tabloids. They do incredible work. And if you do hard work and it disappears into the ether and no one ever hears about it, So I wanted to make impact for the program with the content that we had to give us longevity, to give us impact, to give us visibility. So as someone once jokingly said, I tried to put the news into Newsnight. I mean, it was in the name and I was always chasing it. So I suppose that is the shorthand in the movie of showing how sometimes perhaps my pursuit was, let's get a headline rather than let's have an esoteric intellectual conversation at length. That was really my motivation, for better or worse.
The timing of this film and this scoop, if you will, was when the BBC and really media in general was starting to, shall I say, crater or starting to decline anyway. And right. It begins with the head of the BBC talking about how they were going to have to cut jobs. So it was against this backdrop that you were really pursuing this interview. How big a role did that play in reality of this need for big headlines and big scoops, especially given the fact that the BBC was having financial trouble?
I mean, it's really interesting because unfortunately, the position of most of my colleagues at the BBC and myself for the time that I was there is that every year to 18 months, your job was in peril and you kind of became hardened to the peril. Now from watching the movie, I'm factually a single parent working part-time in a very expensive city. And obviously, lucky to have a BBC salary, but with respect, it doesn't stretch far. So there was real peril for me in my work. My work, though, I tried to keep separate, that pursuit of excellence, trying to bring content that mattered, whether it was a Prince Andrew scoop or whether it was talking to someone in politics or a world leader, trying to keep that content for my program and to make sure that the team got the plaudits that they deserved. That was really my obsession. So In a sense, the two were separate, but we were always and constantly in peril. And Newsnight, sadly, is still in real peril.
Yes, that's a whole different discussion about the state of modern journalism. We could have it another time, but I know that the movie focuses on this huge interview that you were able to secure with Prince Andrew and the inner workings and behind the scenes sort of negotiating and machinations, if you will, that one has to go through, kind of a weird, delicate dance almost that you had to participate in with those who surrounded him. Can you talk a little bit about booking big interviews? This is something I know a little bit about, but from your perspective, what's involved that people would never actually realize?
I think why I'm so proud to be part of this movie, and of course it is ostensibly about my character, but it speaks to the volume of people in news and in journalism who spend weeks, months, maybe years trying to bring these important moments of journalism to the screen. So my job was 99% rejection. You have to be very resilient. You're trying to find the right person to ask for a world leader, or, someone who is, forgive me, plugging a film or a book, as the case may be, or famous actor or actress, or someone in a parlous situation who you're trying to bring into the news forum. So this particular interview, the conversation started 13 months prior. That's not even my shortest period of time. I spent 3 years pursuing a particular interview that I really, really, really wanted. And so you were often just chasing a dream. And most of the work I did seemed impossible and was factually impossible. So a lot of emails, a lot of making sure you're not annoying people, a lot of trying to find the right person, then they leave the job and then you have to start again, a lot of rejection. So it really was a job I met with optimism, relentless optimism, and relentless resilience and hard work, because most of the work I did in my entire career, none of you guys rightly would have ever heard about. This was the one exception.
Well, let's talk about Prince Andrew. This was at a time when the Jeffrey Epstein story was being blown wide open, and his association with Epstein was raising more than a few eyebrows. You had sort of tracked this relationship, hadn't you? Because it had been going on for a long time. Set the scene for us and why this interview was so important and so desirable at that moment.
Well, that's what's so fascinating about the work. At the beginning of our tale, 13 months prior to the interview actually happening, to be frank with you, Prince Andrew was a bit of a forgotten prince. Yes, we knew about his association with Jeffrey Epstein, but Jeffrey Epstein was still at large. Ghislaine Maxwell wasn't even really being spoken about. And Prince Andrew was, effectively slightly forgotten, but doing his thing. As we progressed over this period of time, where the first negotiation I did, where we turned it down, the second one, there was a red line, so the editor turned that down too. Over the months that we were dealing with the palace, the stakes got higher and higher, and the situation for Prince Andrew changed significantly. So the interview on offer at the beginning, 30 months prior, a puff piece, as we call them, talking about his charitable work, was hugely different to the interview that we were then chasing once Epstein was arrested, indicted, died in custody, Ghislaine Maxwell's arrested, and the FBI are involved. And of course, the most important person of all, Virginia Giuffre, is bringing her case and making her allegations against Prince Andrew, which he strenuously denies, afresh. And this important story was being told all over the world. So we go from an interview that is basically not relevant in a sense to the most relevant interview in the world. And so the peril for me obviously completely changed. And
The
that's
nature of the conversation was going to be totally, completely,
Exactly.
utterly different. And when you talk about a red line, we don't necessarily use that in journalistic terms. What do you mean by that? Because it was mentioned in the film as well.
Absolutely. So at the BBC and at Newsnight, we pride ourselves on, not having conditions on our interviews, that they need to be something that has, free to be pretentious momentarily, freedom of speech, access to like proper rigor and bite in our case. And so effectively along the way, there were restrictions, as we would call red lines, and we don't do restrictions. So we politely declined to do the two offers of interviews that we spoke about And then we chased the unfettered interview that we ended up doing, which of course is the duty, in a sense, of the BBC particularly, but of journalism in general.
The original interview was for the pitch at the Palace, kind of a Shark Tank iteration of
a royal iteration of the Apprentice.
Oh yeah, The Apprentice or Shark Tank, right? A little bit of that as well, where he was meeting with entrepreneurs who are trying to, I guess, get attention and maybe some financial assistance for their businesses or startups, whatever. So that was the original request, right? And that's what you were negotiating originally. That never happened, right? You were still in negotiations.
We turned that down because that's what we call a puff piece, which is basically an advert for an individual without proper journalistic rigor. So we declined. When I go back in May for the conversation with Amanda Thirsk, or Keeley Hawes as the case may be, which we dramatize in the movie, we did very well in that conversation, just the two of us. And I managed to get some things back onto the table. Brexit, for example, which usually members of the royal family don't discuss. But the red line, if you like, the restriction, as we might say, that they wanted was to not discuss Jeffrey Epstein.
And you said, no can do.
I said, are you sure you don't want to change your mind? Let's give it 24 hours. And then, of course, I went back to the office. We discussed it. And of course, we can't do a red line. We can't do a condition. So we turned it down twice by now, twice.
And so how did you get them to finally agree that he needed to do this interview, that it would be in his best interest to do this interview, which I'm sure was something that they considered?
Well, because things changed so profoundly between that May period and the November period in which this interview factually took place, because of all of those changes for Jeffrey Epstein being arrested, indicted, dead, Ghislaine Maxwell being arrested, indicted, Prince Andrew and the FBI, Virginia Giuffre. So the story became the biggest story in the world, to be honest. And so obviously my conversations with them changed. The conversation was, everybody is talking about this. People are drawing their own conclusions on you. You keep providing a 5-line written piece of, document to give your refutation. People need to hear from you. The modern landscape is different from what it used to be when Prince Andrew was a young man and a war hero and popular. It was a very different landscape. And if he wanted to change the narrative of how people perceived him, if he wanted to do something to basically talk about these claims and to defend himself, then he needed to do it in person. He needed to do it on camera. That was my argument. That was our argument. And we were offering an incredible opportunity to do that to the nation and to the world. And it was up to him how that opportunity went, because the questions were fair and he was in charge of his answers.
No commitments, no promises, but they've agreed to meet.
Right. This stays in this room, just the four of us. If it leaks that we're even meeting, they could get spooked.
And of course, we know those answers were disastrous, but it could have been different.
Well, let's talk about that, the interview itself. I remember watching it in real time, but rewatching the film version, which I think was probably word for word for the actual interview, you had to wonder, how the hell did his people let him do this? And who prepped him for this interview? And then we'll talk about the disconnect between how you all thought it went at the BBC and how the Palace went. But let's start with the first part. Were you shocked as you watched him answer these questions that he seemed so unprepared and so, I don't know, not really focused on what he was saying?
It's an interesting one, because obviously during my career, I've spent a lot of time with people with a lot of power and success and money. And in essence, Prince Andrew is the most extreme example of that. He is a creature of the creation of the royal family, of his birth. He's been told for 59 years at this stage that he's incredible, amazing, and brilliant. He's been told, he doesn't need to worry about his bills. He's never had a 360 or an appraisal. He's never had to get a job or worry about any of the things that keep most of our feet on the ground. But CEOs around the world, they're surrounded by people who tell them that they're amazing. And he is just a very extreme example of that. So to put it bluntly, no one ever thinks they're going to do a bad interview. He had people around him who believed in him. And that is the job, to believe in the person that you're working for. And, you know, I kind of feel for Amanda Thirsk, who was a brilliant person who I dealt with, so cool, calm, collected, and professional. And she believed in him and she thought he would do a good job. And he believed in himself 100 times over and thought that he would do a brilliant job too.
And yet, I have to say, Sam, this was a very serious matter. It was about accusations that he was really a pedophile, that he had sex with underage girls, or at least one underage girl. And these were huge legal issues. So this wasn't your run-of-the-mill interview where I cannot believe that the palace didn't provide lawyers for him, didn't advise him, that a crisis manager didn't advise him. It just seems so bizarre to me.
I mean, because I wasn't with him, I don't know the exact machinations of, you know, who advised him and who didn't. But I can tell you that factually in the negotiation on the Monday, which we dramatize in the movie, where you see my character, or me, as the case may be, Billy Piper, saying to him about him being known as Randy Andy, that factually happened on the Monday.
With respect, you know how people see you.
Spell it out.
Randy Andy.
With respect.
And on that Monday, he said some of the things that you guys heard on camera to us in that room, including Pizza Express Woking and about the medical condition that he said that he had about not sweating. So we had it on the Monday. And you know, because of the work that you do, that no one ever says that on camera. So on the Monday, we spoke to them. They said yes on the Tuesday. The interview's on the Thursday. My assumption was that when the camera came on, it would be effectively 45 minutes of apologizing in different ways for his friendship, of regret about the pain that, you know, Virginia Giuffre had suffered, while obviously trying to get around a liability or confessing to having done anything, because he still strenuously denies it. But we had heard it on the Monday, and I never believed he'd say it on camera. So in a sense, my shock was the fact that he hadn't been told not to say any of those things by the Thursday. He obviously felt that they were credible things to put into the public domain to explain his behavior. And obviously the public had a different view.
How involved were you in coming up with the questions he was asked? I thought that the anchor, played by Gillian Anderson, did a masterful job and really kept her cool during the whole interview process. How true was that to the actual interview? And can you tell us about writing those questions? Because I've been in that situation and it's often a team effort.
100%. So the only sane person by this stage, Kate, to be honest with you, was Esme Wren, who's played by Romola Garai in the movie. She stayed at the office. She was in charge of this. She took responsibility. And really, in a sense, it was mostly Emily and her locked away in a room together, bearing the burden, to be honest, of this massive responsibility. Because being a booker is a bit like being a surrogate parent. You kind of give birth to the baby, and then you have to hand the baby over. And into their incredible hands, I was able to put this opportunity, and obviously other people worked on the team with me in later stages of the negotiation, but they took that responsibility, which was onerous and huge, and they spent those 2 days preparing those cool, calm, collected, methodical, brilliant questions that gave him space with his answers to tell us what we needed to know.
What did you make of the fact that the palace was like, well done, and he felt great and he was smiling and seemed to be very pleased with himself following an interview, which by every account was a complete and utter disaster?
I think that was the most extraordinary moment for me, because obviously you have to keep a poker face throughout an interview like that. The level of professionalism is really important. Inside, of course, you're dying as a journalist. You know, you can't believe what he's saying. But as I lifted my eyes, I was 15 feet behind him at the end of that interview. You see a real difference in the reaction of the journalistic team, all of whom look ashen. I mean, we hadn't slept, you know, we were delirious. We knew the importance of what we had in terms of his interview answers. And the prince himself, who, as you rightly say, looked pleased as punch. So the space between the reactions really spoke, I feel, to his misunderstanding about how good his answers had been.
What was the immediate impact when that interview aired? And was it a slow realization on the part of the palace that this was not a good thing for Prince Andrew?
Yes, I mean, I can only imagine what it was like, being in the palace, watching this play out, because for us, it was an extreme situation to see it travel around the world. And usually, the jury's out for some people. You get 50%, you get good feedback, bad feedback. The world agreed that this had been a disastrous situation, and his answers were difficult and bad and at best. And so it was a very difficult time, for us dealing with the volume of people coming in and talking to us about this and wanting to talk about this interview. And I can only imagine the slow realization that he had of how terribly this had truly gone. I'll never know for sure. I wasn't there with him, of course, but it must have been a real baptism of fire those days after. And even now, these years later, we are still talking about this interview, and it features in the British press almost every day, to be honest with you, in a mention or something somewhere. So
Really?
it's quite something. Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about the impact this interview had. What transpired following its airing?
Absolutely. I mean, in no way are we looking to kind of claim responsibility for the incredible work that, Virginia Giuffre did, and, her situation, and the lawyers, and, the work that they were doing on her behalf. But factually, there was civil litigation that was happening that came to a conclusion after this interview aired. He accepted no liability, but it was rumored to be a very big sum. And in a small part, I expect that the conversation around him and this interview played a small part in that. But what it meant for him was that just 4 days after this interview aired, he was effectively sacked by his own mother. The Queen's favorite son, as he was, had to withdraw from public life. And he now lives, in a sense, as some kind of, pariah, really, in comparison to the incredible time he had when he was a war hero as a young man. So really, for him, the consequences were fast, and they were very clear, and they were very unusual. And of course, watching as I was at home on my sofa, like eating some Pringles, I think other snacks are available, with my son, minding my own business under a heated blanket because energy prices here are crazy. And that flashed on the screen, and I could not believe it, because to see this journalism, Emily's hard work, Esme's hard work, the Newsnight team's hard work, come to this incredible outcome when we never envisaged that. So it was really quite an overwhelming and swift outcome for him.
Tell me about some of the other big interviews you booked, Sam, while you were at the BBC.
Well, all the full gamut. I mean, everyone from Julian Assange. If you've had the good luck or misfortune, as the case may be, to read my book, a particular handshake inside the Ecuadorian embassy, I've never really recovered from. It lingered, let's say. World leaders, Justin Trudeau, Netanyahu, and then famous people like, Amy Schumer, that kind of vibe. So we had really the full gamut in terms of the people that I was allowed to chase. And I one day would be dealing with, the American embassy, and the next day I would be dealing with a Hollywood agent. So a really eclectic mix. But as I said, most of it would be no. So it would be the exception when someone said yes, because who would want to come on with someone like Emily Maitlis, the foremost presenter in the UK, one of the most brilliantly gifted journalists in the world, and risk it all? It's a hard sell, but I was the person that was trying to do that sell.
And I guess it depends on what you're talking about in any given interview. Some are riskier than others. You talk about getting the answer no. What was the one big interview that got away that you most regret not securing?
Well, I secured an interview that my team declined, and I'm not a bitter person, but I'm still talking about it 10 years later, so maybe I'm more bitter than I thought. We had the opportunity of an interview with Dennis Rodman, and he'd just come back from North Korea, where he formed an unlikely friendship with the somewhat murderous premier of that country. He'll probably sue me now, what can I say? And I had the opportunity to have the first interview with him, not only with pictures of him and Kim Jong-un, the great leader, smoking cigars, but from the Vatican, because he just had a meeting with the Pope. It was, to me, basically the catnip. I don't know if that's a phrase in America. It was like, could it get any better? And my team declined it. And I must admit, I don't sulk very often, but I sulked for, I would say, at least a day. And clearly I've mentioned it now 10 years later. So perhaps that was the one that got away. It just felt like a no-brainer to me, but to everyone else, it didn't feel like the right fit. And them's the breaks.
Well, tell me, what was the rationale for not wanting to do it?
I think because the idea was that it wasn't kind of, intellectually edifying enough, and the Newsnight audience perhaps wouldn't be very familiar with Dennis Rodman. But I just feel if someone is, a global figure who happens to be basically a celebrity, who perhaps as well sometimes might be quite magical on television for good and bad reasons, but who has factually met someone that very few people in the world ever get to meet, who geopolitically is in charge of an area that's hugely important to global security, I think we should have done it. But, I wasn't in charge.
You left the BBC in 2021 after being there for quite a number of years. Do you miss it at all?
Oh, there were great people there and I had some amazing times. But I have to be honest, no, I'm very fortunate to have been able to do some incredible things since I left and wrote the book. I mean, who imagines being on set of a Netflix movie with an exceptional cast, being played by Billie Piper, who, to be honest, is an icon in our country and around the world? It just doesn't happen to anyone. I'm the luckiest woman alive. And so it would be churlish of me to say anything other than the truth, which is it was an incredible career. I loved every second, but I'm really enjoying this new adventure and I feel hugely fortunate to be on it.
And you're teaching the art of negotiating at college level, is that right?
Yeah, there's a university here called the London School of Economics. And
I've heard of it.
Yeah, then they have a law school and the dean there saw me speak and he invited me to be, it sounds so impressive and I'm impressed every time I say it, visiting senior fellow. Not quite sure what that is, but doesn't it sound impressive?
It does.
And I teach negotiation, non-legal negotiation on a legal skills course at London School of Economics. So really, that's also another dream come true. Netflix and academia. As I said, who would have guessed it when I left and wrote this tiny little book that all of this magic would come my way?
Well, I can't let you go, Sam, without asking you a question about the current woes of the British royal family. There have been a lot of conversations about the way this was covered, not only the way the palace handled it, but sort of the way it was discussed online with all the rumors and the conspiracy theories. And I know that you love tabloids. I don't love tabloids quite as much as you do. I think they can be grossly irresponsible and twist things and misrepresent people, but that's another conversation altogether as well. But has there been any sort of second guessing or evaluation among your journalistic peers about how this whole chapter of the royal family has been covered and discussed?
Well, I would say, first of all, that, obviously tabloids do some great work and some great journalism sometimes, but my interest was really in making impact for the esoteric, highfalutin content.
Right, to bring a little more news for the common man to the broadcast.
Yeah, exactly. It's good to access every home rather than just a few homes. I think in this particular case, journalism is a broad church. And there are things that happen that perhaps we are concerned about that concern us deeply, like chasing, down people in very difficult situations. And then there are things that journalism does that can be incredibly helpful, like this scoop. So I try not to conflate them together. But to your point, I think that really the pressure on the palace to provide information to a very hungry global audience, even the people who say they're not interested, most of the time they actually are, must be huge. And it's obviously painful to see a young woman in a very difficult situation, and a king, obviously, who has health concerns as well, having to discuss that in, plain sight. And that is the burden, of course, of being a member of the royal family and the burden of the communications people. And it is a symptom of the modern world where we want to know everything about everyone, but then say that we didn't really want to know it. And that's the irony at the center of this. And I know we both just wish that both of them returned to good health and that none of them really had to talk about this in the public domain.
Well, Sam McAlister, the movie is called Scoop. It's really the story of you, scooping the competition and actually convincing the palace and Prince Andrew that this is something he should do and needed to do. By the way, did his assistant or the woman you were dealing with in the film, did she get sacked or did she resign?
I believe it was a combination of the two. I mean, she was a brilliant woman to deal with. She was calm, cool, professional, full of integrity. I really, really liked her. And we both know when you're second in command in her case, or 22nd in my case, if things go wrong, we both know who's going to take the fall. And, you know, very unfortunately, I know people would say rightly, but very unfortunately, she obviously lost her job and her livelihood. So a very difficult situation for her, and it could have been me.
Well, again, Sam, thank you so much. It's really fun to talk to you, and I hope that I get to meet you in person one day. We can swap war stories.
We can swap war stories over alcohol. I'll be there. And thank you for your time.
Thanks, Sam.